Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. Sometimes the news and social media is flooded with difficult stories, sad news, and alarming statistics. It can get a bit too much. That's why I think we always need stories that are full of hope and warmth, reminding us that although there might be sadness and challenges, there is much love and light in the world and in our lives too. For this reason, I love the work of Sara Nisha Adams, an author whose books are uplifting, warm, and wholesome. Sara Nisha's books are based around community, togetherness, making unlikely friendships, healing from grief and loneliness, and finding and choosing family. I have loved the two books she's written so far, and I'm so glad she's my guest today. Sara Nisha Adams is a writer and editor. She lives in London and was born in Hertfordshire to Indian and English parents. Her debut novel, The Reading List, is partly inspired by her grandfather who lived in Wembley and immediately found a connection with his granddaughter through books. Her latest novel, The Twilight Garden, came out in June 2023. It tells the story of warring neighbours Winston and Bernice who put aside their differences to nurture and grow a communal garden. What develops is an unlikely friendship, healing from grief, and so much more. Hello, Sara Nisha. Welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf. Thank you for joining me today. How are you doing?
Hi, Samia. Thank you so much for having me. It's so nice to be here and to chat to you.
Oh, I'm really excited that you're here. You have written two absolutely beautiful novels so far, The Reading List and also most recently, The Twilight Garden. And I love them both. And I think what I love so much is that you have a really distinct style and voice, even though the stories you tell are quite different from one another. And I just want to know, where did writing come from for you? Where did it all start?
Oh, thank you so much. That's so lovely to hear. It's always so nerve-wracking when you put books out into the world and hope people will love the story. So thank you. It really means a lot. I think for me, writing, I've been writing since I was tiny, and I was always just making up stories. And I think probably I was an only child, so I had a lot of time on my own, and I just liked to make stories about characters who could hang out with me. And I was always writing down on scraps of paper that I could find whenever I could, just to occupy myself. And pretty much it went hand in hand with reading. As soon as I could read and could discovered books, I wanted to create my own stories too. It just feels a bit like magic, being able to conjure up people and whole worlds with your imagination. So I've always really enjoyed it. I think it's taken me quite a while to find my style. For years I was kind of writing like all the books I was reading, trying to just work out what worked best for me. And it wasn't really until I wrote the reading list that I discovered there was a voice that I felt really comfortable with. And I think beforehand I was writing quite dark things sometimes, and I think there are elements of that in my stories, but I think what I found really spoke to me was that element of hope and joy, and I think that will probably be present in all my books no matter what the subject matter is, because I really enjoy reading that. I enjoy reading everything, but I also really enjoy, you have to spend a lot of time with the books that you're writing. So I think writing something that has an element of hope in, no matter what the story is or what the subject matter is, really appeals to me, and it feels kind of quite right for me as I am now. I mean, who knows if I will completely drastically change my style in the future, but I kind of don't think that will ever go.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that was my first impression of the reading list. Even when I was reading it, I was just like, oh my gosh, this is so wholesome.
Oh,
It's just so uplifting and very sweet. And then when I heard that a second book was coming out, I was a bit nervous. I was like, oh, what if she goes a bit darker with it? Then it's going to lose that Sara magic. But yeah, and I think that's why it's just so nice to have stories that are quite positive and uplifting, even if they deal with some difficult issues, because I think that's life, right?
yeah, absolutely.
There's good and bad and dark and light, and bad things happen, and it might just be that a lot of bad things happen to one person in a short period of time or over a long period of time, but there is always, hopefully, like hope and goodness to be seen. But
Absolutely.
also, I think, like with literature and the media, so much of what we see for all communities, really, and all groups of people, is so negative.
Yeah.
So, why exactly is telling uplifting stories so important to you?
Yeah, so as I said, I was writing like some really dark things before, and I always felt that to be taken seriously, you have to be writing kind of dark things, because for a while that was what I was reading, and that's sort of what you see everywhere and on the news. It can feel like there is so much sadness in the world, and it feels like there are so many things that we are facing at the moment as a global community. And I think those stories are really important, but I also think for me, I can get quite lost in sadness, and I can get like quite depressed sometimes. And I think for me, that like remembering that there is still hope and there is still goodness out there, like those moments on the news where you get like a really silly happy story, actually is really quite nice. And while it can feel sometimes quite trivial that something like small and hopeful is happening, when there are so many terrible things going on in the world that we should be focusing on, it is also kind of a little bit of respite, and it's that hope that almost feeds you a bit and kind of
Mm.
can help you go on to keep fighting, I think, and keep surviving and hopefully thriving too. So I think that's really important. But also, I do think books are an opportunity for escapism, and I think that's really important to me. I was reading a lot of crime books at the time because I was a crime editor when I started writing the reading list, and
Yeah.
yeah, dealing with like books with a lot of murders in all the time. I loved it, but also writing the reading list was a little bit of respite for me, where I kind of knew that there would be a hopeful end, hopefully, and there was a thread of joy and love that goes throughout it. And I think that can be in crime books. But yeah, it was just a nice antidote, I think, from a lot of dark, murderous stories for a while. So yeah, that was important to me too. And I do think like we can tell important stories, and the story can ultimately be hopeful too, because as you said, that is life. And while there is so much going on in our lives, and there'll be sadness and there'll be heartbreak and there'll be loss, there will also be love and joy. And I think, I can't remember who said it, someone really wise said that grief is a price we pay for love. And I think that just shows how closely the two are interwoven, and you kind of can't live life with one without the other. And hopefully that's what my stories capture too.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I love that quote. And also, I would never have guessed reading the reading list that at the time you were like steeped in crime fiction. Like
Yeah.
you would never guess that that is actually what you also had going on in your life, because the reading list is
Yeah.
nothing associated. There's no hint of any police drama or murders or anything going on. So I really love that, like that insight that actually it gave you a place to hide, I guess,
Yeah.
almost, from that more gruesome and difficult stuff. I mean, I love watching crime dramas, but I also get very freaked out with them. Like the other day, I was watching a few episodes of a show, and I just got so scared. Even though I don't know that the scene wasn't particularly scary, but I just got so scared. I was like paralyzed, and I had to put the bin outside, and I honestly felt like I was going to cry. I don't know
Oh
why.
no.
It's very bizarre. But just on uplifting stories, I think I mean I love everything that you just said. And one of the things that I feel really strongly about increasingly is that so many authors of color or feel that in order to be a successful author and for their work to be taken seriously, they need to write stories that are about bad things happening
Yeah.
to other people of color. So
Yeah.
in your book, you have a number of Indian characters. So much of what we read is really dark, even in fiction. It's really horrible things happening. And there's so many cases where like where the character doesn't have any element of joy.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think as a young person and as a child, but even as an adult, if that is what you're constantly fed with, is these negative stories, you internalize it and you think
Yeah.
that maybe this is the way that my life is going to go, or this is what everyone thinks about me. And it's a really reductive view of our communities and people in general. So yeah, and I wonder like if you've faced that, or if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're completely right. It feels like when brown people are writing books, it has to be either about race or it has to be about prejudice and racism. And while those are a part of our lives in so many ways, I think it is really important to show that it's just a part. It's not the whole story that we have to tell. So it was really important for me to write a story that was sort of just people living their lives, and it isn't kind of a trend or a gimmick that they are like Indian characters living in Wembley. Like they are just living their lives, and it's not, yeah, it's not trauma porn, I guess, in that way, and it's not, and it just, yeah, it feels like they can have joyful stories too, and we can have them, and it's, yeah, and they should be taken just as seriously, because it does feel like white authors can kind of write any book they want without being pigeonholed in a certain space, and particularly like male white writers as well. And I think it is important that we reclaim that joy and can show that joy is as much a part of our lives, because especially in our communities, there's so much love, there's so much kind of friendship and hope and companionship that we can celebrate too. And while there are like negative things that will go on as well, it's a balance, and like just like everyone, we have a balance of good and bad and hope and sadness, and I think we need to capture that in our stories. We don't have to just write stories that are traumatic or, yeah, really like like sometimes hurtful to read, because I think you're absolutely right. When you're being fed the same story and over again, it sort of feels like there is only one path you can take. But I'm also aware that I can write the stories that I write now because there are so many black and brown writers who have gone before and told and like pushed the boundaries of what like the publishing world has wanted them to tell, and opened up this space. But I do think we need more stories from black and brown writers, because we need more stories of all genres telling a huge variety of stories to show that we are not one thing, we
Mm.
are not all the same, we all have completely different lived experiences. We're not just like all put together in a group, just in the way that white writers can write a huge variety of stories and not be questioned about how come this doesn't tackle this subject that is really pertinent to your community. So I think we need more stories, and I think the more diversity there is in what we give to the world and show the publishing world, that we can do and have and live. That's really babbly, but yeah, I think we need just more stories basically, because yeah, there isn't just one story that we can write, and we have multitudes within us. So we should be showcasing all of those stories as much as we can.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think what I just want to see a little bit more of as well is kind of, you know, how you said white writers can write about anything. And I mean, and they write about like groups of friends going on holiday and like, but they also write just about a huge range of things. And the books are judged as being good books or bad books. But I feel
Yeah.
like when there's black and brown authors that write about just like, say, I don't know, like a woman in her 30s just living her best life, and it's a really great story, really great character, but it's seen as being like, this is groundbreaking and this is revolutionary. White writers have been writing the same kind of stories with their characters for so long, and they've been loved and appreciated just for being a great story. But all of a sudden, when we're doing it, because it's so different and it's moving away from everything that up until now our authors have felt almost compelled to write about,
Yeah.
it's being seen as revolutionary. But actually, this is a mirror of the lives that so many people lead,
Yeah.
right? Like the great things that everyone's doing in their life. So I really, yeah, I really hope that we continue to see more stories and a more variety of stories as well. And I think the thing that I really like in your stories and in your character development and presentation of characters is that you have this like just very normal representation of culture, of Indian culture or even like British culture, but it's just kind of like, well, this is just how it is. It's never it's never a thing, right? Like, yeah, of course it impacts the characters, and they often reflect on their identity, and they might be eating certain types of food, and it's really like it feels very true and authentic to the character. It never feels gimmicky. What has that been like for you, kind of deciding how to weave in the culture, especially because you always have quite like a diverse range of characters? So how do you get that right?
Yeah, so I always wanted their culture and to be sort of just the background, because it is like the background to our lives and it's important in so many ways in shaping our identity, but the story itself is like the character's journey, and it doesn't necessarily need to be defined by the fact that like Mukesh is a Hindu living in Wembley who lived in Kenya and then moved to London. Like that's background to his life, and it kind of helps you understand who he is and where he comes from and what sort of why he's reacting in certain ways, but it's not the whole story itself. So that's always been important to me, because it's sort of those little details that I used to spot in novels that just, I don't know, they just like literally filled my soul with like happiness, that I saw someone like who ate the same foods as me, but also they just went on with their normal lives. It wasn't like, let's write a whole book about food and show how different this food is from
Mm,
British food and stuff like that, because it is just their lives and it's normal. Like we're living our lives, and all our background is sort of just a given to us. So I sort of wanted it to be captured like that in the book. Um, so yeah, and I think, as I said like earlier, that I do think for so long, like black and brown people have been kind of compelled by the publishing industry to write books that are sort of specific to them, but actually we are all so similar in so many ways as well. So it we don't have to be defined by our culture entirely. That doesn't have to be the whole story. We can make our stories within that. So that was always important to me, for it not to feel like it I was having to write a book about like Hinduism or something, or sort of really kind of overdo it, because also I just wanted those touch points. So if people have a similar background to Mukesh, they recognize it, but I didn't want to overly explain anything for like a white reader or a reader who didn't really understand Hinduism or Mukesh's community. I just wanted those like little touch points to be in there for people who did know the community to be like, yeah, I know that, without you having to over explain it in any way, because that's not the main story. That's just sort of, yeah, background to the character. I think that answers your question, but I'm not sure.
yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And I like the way that you just sort of said, like, you know, that's not the main story. That's just kind of like who these characters are, and this is their background.
Yeah.
So where do your stories come from? Because obviously, like, the reading list is a very particular story about one library. It starts off with Mukesh and it's a few people, and then the Twilight Garden is about one residential area, two neighbours, and a garden. Like, where do these specific stories come from?
Yeah, I think they take quite a lot of time to like fully form in my mind, but I will always start, I think, with a scenario. So for the reading list, I thought about someone turning up to the library, not really knowing anything about books, and then meeting someone who maybe didn't have any recommendations for them, and how that situation might go. And I knew that I wanted to set it in Wembley, and my dada, my grandfather, had quite, I knew that he was going to be like the start of the story, because he always used to ask me about the books I was reading, because I didn't speak Gujarati in my grandparents' home, and that was the language that they spoke predominantly. So I would always sort of just sit in the corner and read a book. And Dada would always ask me what book I was reading, and I would start to explain it, and then he knew, I think, that that was the way into my world, the way to make me open up, and start talking. And I just sort of thought, what if I hadn't had that? What if, like, my grandparent hadn't been interested in the books that I was reading? So that's sort of where you start with Mukesh and Priya, except he does really want to know what she's reading. He just doesn't really know where to start. So you have like a well-intentioned dada trying to connect with his granddaughter. And yeah, so I think I always start, the characters are sort of forming, and then I have like an idea of like that first scene. Sometimes that first scene will stay in the book. So for Mukesh, it was him turning up to the library and trying to open those automatic doors. which didn't really work very well. And then you've got, for the Twilight Garden, I thought about two next door neighbours. So I was living in a top floor flat in Stoke Newington and looking down at this garden below that was completely overgrown, and just like really wishing that I could like get stuck in there.
Oh.
And then we kind of had new neighbours move into the house next door, and they were really loud, and like there were like kids running up and down the stairs, and like the mum kind of always used to ignore us when we were out and about, even though we thought maybe we'll make friends. And I thought of her as a character and thought, what happened if there was a shared garden that sort of forced two neighbours who sort of didn't seem to like each other to interact, at least in some way? Because I think in London you can kind of live your lives among all your neighbours and never get to know them, but you might know exactly what time they leave the house for work. You know what music they listen to, what radio station they like to listen to, what TV programs they watch every night, because you can hear it through the walls, but you don't know anything else about them. So that's sort of where that story came from. And yeah, I think the characters in that book are inspired by people who I lived alongside in Stoke Newington, and people who I got to know, and neighbours who I wanted to get to know too. So sort of it came from, I think, wish fulfillment in wanting to find a community in that space. And yeah, building a community for myself through that book.
Wow. And the Twilight Garden is like really, I mean, there's a lot of specific information in there about plants, like what plants grow in what season and how to plant them and what the soil has to be like. Lots of very specific detail. Are you a gardener? And like where I think you mentioned in your author note at the end that maybe it was your husband that kind of gave some of that knowledge, but are you someone that hangs out in the garden a lot and spends time getting your hands dirty?
I would love to say yes. I love gardening, but I'm rubbish at it. I'm not patient enough. But my husband is a big gardener. Like he was furloughed over lockdown, and he's always wanted to kind of get stuck in. And we just moved to a new, like a flat with a garden, which was amazing. So he had time and energy to just spend on the garden. And yeah, he did a horticultural course and then started doing some work as a garden designer. So he lives and breathes gardens, and I've learned so much from him. And I think over lockdown in particular, because I started writing, well, I kind of wrote a bit of the Twilight Garden first, but then wrote most of it during lockdown when I was just so focused on the garden and watching things grow, and just again, like, kind of feels like the magic of creating something and watching like huge plants grow from a tiny seed. It just, yeah, it sort of feels like nature is amazing. And he knows all the details, and I had to like check loads of things with him, and there was loads I got wrong, and I'm sure there's stuff I still got wrong in the book, but having his knowledge and all his gardening books was so helpful, just to make sure like I had an idea, because I'd been in the garden, I'd seen it go through like a whole season and then some when I was writing it. So I was watching things change and noticing the seasons change, and I found that actually a really peaceful thing to be focusing on. So I love being in the garden and I love being in nature, but all the kind of gardening know-how definitely comes from my husband, and I am useless at gardening.
I mean, it sounds like just like a really peaceful thing to be able to see, and just really lovely how that also kind of like inspired or kind of like fueled, I guess, in some ways, the book as well. But one key element of both the Twilight Garden and the reading list is grief. So in the reading list, we have Mukesh, whose wife has very sadly passed away, and then in the Twilight Garden, it's Winston who's lost his mother. And you provide like what I think to be quite like a really emotive exploration of grief. And there was just this one bit from the reading list that has stayed with me, where Mukesh was asking himself, like, did I do enough? Like, did I do enough? And Winston as well, he's just wrought with, I don't know if it's like regret and a little bit of shame, perhaps, and embarrassment. But that is a really difficult thing to write about? It's obviously because it's a massively difficult thing to experience. What was important to you when writing about grief, and why did you decide to have that to be such a big element of both of your work so far?
Yeah, I find this really interesting when I'm asked it, because I think in so many ways I didn't consciously like go out to write a book about grief, but it felt quite natural. And I think probably a lot of my life I do think about moments when I have had like profound grief, when I've lost loved ones. And I think particularly over the pandemic, I lost like several family members and like both my grandmothers, which was like a strange way to grieve when you're completely on your own. So in many ways, I was like very much with Winston then, just this idea of like being far away from the people that you've loved and lost. Um, but I think it just feels to me like quite a human thing. And I think so many of us are grieving in so many ways, whether we have lost someone or whether we're grieving kind of past friendships or relationships that are a loss in themselves anyway. And I think it was just, it really felt to me like starting Mukesh's journey in particular with grief. Yeah, this sounds really cheesy, but for years I was writing stories that always ended with grief, and I kind of couldn't see past that. Kind of having lost loved ones when I was a teenager, for years I was writing stories that just like the grief was the end of the story. And the reading list was sort of the first time that grief was almost the beginning of the story, and I could see kind of hope and life afterwards, because kind of reflecting on my own experiences of grief, like I have been completely floored by grief before, and but I also have always noticed that, well, haven't always noticed, most recently I've noticed that I still find hope afterwards. And there are things that grief can open up to you, things that you notice, and whether it like starts with regret or sadness, that there are so many things you wish you'd have told someone before they went. You can then, there are sort of changes that you can make in future to remind yourself that there's still there's still time with other people that you love, and to not take those moments for granted. So I think starting with grief, probably for both Mukesh and Winston, was really important for me to show the life that comes after grief too, because I think the most inspiring thing about humans is that we are so resilient and we can go through so much, and we grieve and we suffer, and but we survive, and then we can kind of keep going. And I think that is so inspiring, because there are so many things in our lives that kind of you step back and think, actually, I can't believe that like you can do anything after that, but we can, and we do every single day. And I find that really inspiring. So I think I really wanted to write a story kind of without realizing that that's what I was doing, that started with grief and shows all the life that comes afterwards.
Yeah, well, I'm very sorry for all your loss. Sounds like you've had a lot of time or a lot of grief over the last few years. So I'm very, very sorry to hear about everyone that has passed that you have loved. And I think as well, like the years of the pandemic were full of so much grief for so many people. I think whether it seemed in some ways just a really strange time, because although people were also were passing away due to COVID, we were hearing so many stories of other people passing away for unrelated reasons as well. And it was all probably linked in some way, shape, or form. But there was also this sort of like global sense of mourning that was happening, because the news was extremely heavy. It was very scary, full of uncertainty. So I really love how you have used that as like the start point rather than the end point. And I think in both of your stories, it is an exploration of healing, and how, you know, through friendship and coming together, in both cases, something that is community based as well, can help that healing process. And I honestly, like, I really love that. One of the other things that you write about is loneliness, and obviously this kind of goes with grief, but also not, because there are characters in your books that are very lonely, even though that they haven't lost anyone, but they're also lonely but not necessarily alone. So they could be lonely within a relationship, or they're, you know, raising a family, or their parent, you know, there's issues with their siblings and their mother. Like, loneliness is such a big issue. Yeah, what inspired you to also tackle that, and what is your view on what we can do more generally to tackle the it's like almost like an epidemic of loneliness,
Yeah.
I'd say. What do you think we can do to tackle that?
Yeah, that's a really big question. So, in terms of what inspired me to write about loneliness, I think just having met so many people in my life and kind of having experienced loneliness myself, it just does feel like something that sort of is can be ever present in our lives. And there'll be times when we aren't lonely, but there will be so many times when we are. And I think loneliness is particularly profound when it is in those moments when you're surrounded by people, or you're in a huge bustling family home but you don't feel like anyone's kind of connected with you in so long. And I think that can be one of the most isolating experiences. I think I've always felt particularly lonely kind of like after a big change, or like when I first moved to London, I remember feeling so lonely. And yeah, just kind of didn't know what to do, didn't know how to make friends. I was like working really hard and was starting to make friends at work, but it wasn't at that stage where I could like invite them around for a cup of tea or something. That felt a bit too keen. So I just remember spending a lot of time on my own with books, and I think quite often like reading about other characters who were lonely made me feel like a bit less alone, because it feels like you're not the only person going through this. I think in terms of tackling it, I do think, yeah, I think especially in an age where everything is online and there's social media, and I think social media can be so amazing in so many ways and kind of people forming communities and can be a really helpful way to combat loneliness. But on the flip side, I think it's also can be something that can make us feel really lonely, especially if you're sort of like looking at loads of people having great times with all their friends, and sometimes it feels like that everyone is living a perfect life and you're not, and it's so easy to compare your life with others. So I think you kind of have to find out what works for you. But I think community spaces, and like that's why like the library, I think like libraries are amazing for so many things, but in particular to like bring people together. And there are like clubs at lots of libraries, and like sessions where you can knit and have a chat, which is like so lovely. But also just like it's a space where everyone can just be around each other. And I do think sometimes if you are just in a space where everyone's quietly just getting on with things, and sometimes that can make you feel a little bit less lonely than if you're sort of just like in your flat or something, or in your room on your own. I think just like being around people without them like bustling past you or like elbowing you on the tube or something, it can kind of just help you feel a part of something. So I think community things and community spaces are so important, in particularly in cities. It's so important to sort of like bring people together. And I think those friendships that you can make with people who maybe don't seem anything like you, sometimes so valuable, because they just show you that there are so many people going through similar things to us, where actually they seem like they've got completely different lives. And those friendships I think can be so valuable. And I think I've made lots of those friendships over the years, and they've really helped me kind of feel a bit less lonely, and like help me like realize that you can find friendship in so many different places. You don't just have to like think, oh, I like this one thing, so I'll just be friends with people who like this one thing too, or whatever. That sounds a bit cliche, but you know what I mean. Hopefully. So, yeah, I do think loneliness is a huge issue, in particular when we're living our lives online. I think finding ways for us to connect with other people is so important. And if that's online, that's great. But if being online doesn't make you feel great, then I think, yeah, community spaces can be hugely important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think loneliness is a really it's actually a bigger deal than we maybe first may think of, or
Yeah,
that we even talk about, because I feel like it probably affects everyone in some way, shape, or form, whether you're in a huge family or whether you're living by yourself. I think
yeah,
it shows its head in like so many different ways, and part of it is to do with like how maybe like how connected you feel to like your work, or how happy you are by your living. Like it's really complicated, but unless we create spaces and we kind of like help people feel less alone, we're not tackling it. And I
hmm,
think what you said about social media is really like profound and really right, because the thing about social media is like you're bombarded with so much content all of the time. by people that you don't even know,
Yeah.
or people that seemingly also know lots of other people. And so it's really easy to feel like you're the only one that's struggling, or you're the only one that's unhappy, or whatever it may be. And it's not the case. I do think that so much of social media is a highlight reel,
Yeah.
especially I think the bigger kind of influencers and content creators. I think for sure, not everyone, well, I don't think everyone really is just jetting off on holiday and having the time of their life all of the time. But it's hard to remember that in the moment, right, when you're scrolling
Yeah.
and you're like just bombarded with these images of people on the beach having a party. Like it's really difficult. And I feel that a lot especially for young people, kind of like teenagers, especially, I think, especially
Yeah.
when they're also still kind of tied down with school and family, and they feel like this is not the life I want to lead. And then when you do get a bit older and you're trying to create that life, and you realize that there's a big gap between where you want to be and where you can be
Yeah.
for various reasons. And that's a really difficult thing to deal with. So yeah, I really appreciated that you try to bring that to the fore, and also bringing together people in public spaces like libraries and like gardens. And obviously our libraries are under attack anyway.
Mm.
So I do hope that we're able to save more of them as time goes on. But you, obviously you have a balance in your writing between dealing with some of these bigger, sadder themes like grief and loneliness, but also hope and friendship and love, all different kinds of love. How do you get that balance right? And also, like, how do you, because if fundamentally your book is uplifting and happy, how do you stay focused to that? Like when you're having a really bad day, how do you not suddenly feel like, oh my gosh, I should just give Winston a devastated ending? Like how do you how do you not let that kind of take over?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting because I think my books definitely feel like a slightly different world to me. Um, and I think it's quite nice for me to escape into them and sort of feel a little bit more hopeful when I'm in there. And I think I like to be kinder to my characters than I am to myself, because I think I'm always a bit negative to myself, and will always have like an inner critic telling me like I'm not good enough and stuff like that. And I try, I think, to approach my characters a bit more like they're my friends, and I know that you can't shy away from the realities of life because that is just life. And I also think that's having those kind of moments that the characters like go through like big things and life-changing things and grief and everything. They're those things that really, I think, help people connect to the characters, because that is, I think, we can connect to each other because of things that we're grieving or things that we've lost, because we all have an empathy for that, or so many of us do. So I think it's really important in kind of building the characters as to be like fully rounded people, to show like both sides of their personalities as well. And like they're not always like absolutely perfect either. They all have their own flaws, and I think we all see sort of like the flaws in ourselves too. So I try to approach them with a little bit more kindness than I approach myself, but still try to make them feel as real as possible, so they still have like their doubts and their prejudices, and they still have things like hopes and dreams that they maybe don't feel that they can reach. So because I think we all do have have those elements within us. Yeah, I don't think I ever want to make life really hard for them, but I do know there are sometimes things that happen in the stories. I'm just like, I really wish that didn't have to go through this, but I don't know. There's something that just tells me that I know that they're gonna have to go through like something big, because sometimes that is the moment that sort of helps steer them to the next part of their journey. Or do you know what I mean? Sometimes that can be the moment that's absolutely devastating, but can also be something that really brings another part of themselves to the story or to themselves, and like helps them connect with other characters. And I think we feel that in life too. I think big moments in our lives that can be devastating are also moments that can steer us in a different direction or introduce us to new people. So yeah, I think that definitely my books feel like a different world for me, and when I slip into them, it feels a little bit warmer, a little bit more hopeful, and I kind of hope that readers feel that too in lots of ways, that it does feel like a safe place in lots of ways, but isn't completely shielded from what really goes on in life too. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, I hope that it feels hopeful for other people as well.
It does, and I think, I mean, this is why, like, as a child, like, I escaped life through books because it felt different from my life. It felt, in some of the books I was reading anyway, it felt safer and happier, and that is what we need sometimes. But also to be able to see elements of your own experiences, even if it's not exactly the same,
Yeah.
but to see that there's this character who is going through something difficult, but is coming out of it, and although is going through it difficult, you're also a very, like, kind of dignified in the way that you present it as well. Like, there's nothing particularly gory, or like it seems very kind of like polite, almost very gentle, which is really good. Yeah, and yeah, so definitely, like, I think listening to you speak as well, I kind of feel like you feel like you have a responsibility for your characters and that you want to look after them, which is so nice. And does it feel like that this is some like a world and like people that you're creating, and that you want to kind of, like, you know, you're almost like their mother or their creator or their big sister? Does it feel like that when you're working?
Sometimes, but also I'm aware that sometimes they do, like, sometimes the story is just really clear in what they're going to do. And I think when I start the story, I feel very much almost like in control of them, trying to work out who they are. But they quite quickly, I know I've heard lots of writers say this, and I've always thought I don't really understand what that means. But when I'm writing, I do understand it. They do just sort of take on a bit of a life of their own. And once you get to know the characters, it becomes quite clear what they will do in certain situations, and I can try and like make them do something else, but I'm just like, it doesn't feel right. Like, they wouldn't do this, and they wouldn't say this wouldn't happen. So they do just sort of take on a bit of a life of their own. So it doesn't always feel that I'm really in control of them, but more that, like, I do want to look after them and kind of want to help them through things. But yeah, like, life comes at them sometimes, and I can't always like shield them from that, because they as characters have become fully formed in themselves, and it's quite obvious that they'll do a different thing from what maybe like big sister Sarah would suggest they do. And that's actually like the most fun part, where it's just, yeah, you're writing and you're typing things out, but really it's almost like your brain is disengaged and the characters are taking over. And yeah, whenever I hear authors say that, I'm like, I don't really know what you mean. But when I'm writing, I know exactly what they mean. It does just feel like they take on a whole life of their own, and they're
Yeah,
in charge.
I have had a lot of authors actually say similar thing, because I remember once I read this book and I was really horrified by the ending. I was just like, that is not the way I wanted the book to end. And when I spoke to the author, she was just like, Samia, I had to write the ending that was right for the character, and it just felt like that was what she was going to choose. And when she said that to me initially, I was like, no, like, you're the author, obviously you can decide. But then when I spoke to her at length, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, no. It
Yeah.
sounds really interesting, because actually somebody once told me recently, she told me that when she's writing, she may get to a point in the plot where she's not quite sure like what's going to happen. So in that moment, she'll, as a filler, will put in something based on her own traits. So maybe what she would do or what she would say, and then she'll like carry on with the book, and then she'll come back to it, and then she'll be able to be like, okay, well, is this what this character would have done, or is this just me? And she might change it or might keep it in, which I also found just a really interesting,
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Process. And I love hearing the different ways in which authors write, because I feel like everyone has their own like style, but also just their own way of doing things in terms of like what comes first and what takes precedence, and how much people plan.
Yeah.
How much do you plan your stories?
Yeah, so I never used to plan, and then the reading list was the first time I wrote out like a proper full synopsis, and it was also the first time that I actually managed to finish writing a whole book. So, I mean, I had written a whole book before, but it was terrible and needed a plan. But yeah, every other book I'd written was like unfinished. I didn't know where it was going. But thankfully with the reading list I kind of knew exactly how it was going to end. But I also like spent time trying to work out what was going to go on in the middle and how the characters would get there. So that really, really helped in the writing of it. For the Twilight Garden, I did have a plan, but every time I like started writing it, I kind of roughly knew how it would end. But yeah, it kind of just took on a bit of a life of its own. It's quite complicated with like two timelines as well. So yeah, it was a completely different beast in so many ways. And I really wanted to just write it exactly as I'd written the reading list with the plan, stick to the plan, don't really diverge from the plan that much unless like the characters needed to do something else. Um, but yeah, it didn't really work out that way with the Twilight Garden. I had so many like Excel spreadsheets trying to plot it out really clearly. Every draft, that plot almost changed completely and got rejigged at every single stage.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, it was completely, it felt like learning to like write a book again. And I think I thought, but as I was approaching the second book, I was like, I know how to write a book now.
Mhm.
I know what my process is, and yeah, it didn't work out that way. And I'm writing the third book now, and again, I think I'm learning how to write a book again, and it's like different to the Twilight Garden and the reading list and how I'm approaching it. So we'll see. I don't think I've got a process yet, and I don't know if I'm a planner or a pantster, as they say. Yeah, I might be a mix of the two.
It's really interesting as well that when you came to write the Twilight Garden, that it was so different from the first. But I guess because the book is itself is quite different, but still very much in your voice. But still, the story is very different.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why, I don't know. But yeah, that's really interesting insight. Um, the other thing I love that you write about is the development of unlikely friendships. Especially in the Twilight Garden, because we had these warring neighbours that ultimately became friends in the end. And I like that. And obviously, like, I was really hopeful at the beginning that they were going to become friends and we were going to understand why she was being so horrible.
Yeah,
Because like she was just a bit, she didn't need to be as mean as she was being. So
I know.
and then when you kind of, you understand her perception and like her experiences, and I really started to feel sorry for her because she was not in a good place. But why did you decide to have also unlikely friendships rather than like likely friendships? So it wasn't, for
Yeah,
example, that like Winston went to a garden center and met another gardener.
yeah.
It's just two people that you wouldn't think would get on all of a sudden did get on. Why did you decide to explore that?
Yeah, because I think it's so fascinating. It's almost a bit more interesting to explore like two very different people who also completely clash early
Mm.
on. And I think Bernice is a really interesting character in the sense that I don't know, I really did not like her at the beginning. I really found her like quite hard to write because I kept like almost not wanting to spend time with her. I was like, oh,
Mm.
you're really annoying, and you say things like that are not in a that are so inappropriate, and you're treating Winston awfully, and I'm not a fan of that because I loved him. But I found like as I got to know her a bit better and sort of like had to like dig into her a bit more and work out what was going on underneath, I was also acting a little bit like an unlikely friendship with her because I was sort of working out who she really was and like why she was the way she is. And I think it's I think in life we can meet so many people who like we make first impressions of them straight away and we decide that we don't like them. And like that's what Winston and Bernice do for each other. But they're in a situation where they literally live next door and they kind of have no choice but to sort of I guess like see each other more and engage with each other a bit more, especially if they're going to do up this garden. And when Bernice's son Seb starts talking to Winston, she either has to like be really mean and say you can't ever talk to our neighbor, or she has to maybe try and like hang out with them all a bit more. So she's sort of they're forced to get to know each other. And you don't always get that in real life, where quite often you can like meet people, maybe you're like, no, they're not my kind of person, and you move on. But sometimes I think, wouldn't it be so interesting if we gave people a little bit more time and kind of worked out really who they are, why they are the way they are? And maybe you'll be like, yeah, we're not like the same kind of person still. We're very different. We've got very different ideas about the world and stuff, and that's fine. You move on. But there might be people who you've made judgments on straight away, but actually there's so much going on underneath, and maybe you realize that actually what they're showing to the world is a mask. It's them trying to be braver than they are, bolder than they are, to protect themselves. And I think so many of us can relate to that. So that's sort of what I like to explore in those characters and those unlikely friendships. It's just like the breaking down of those masks, and like the walls
Mm,
come down and they realize that actually they're both vulnerable in so many ways, and there's so many ways to connect with each other because
mm.
they've both gone through similar things, even if the masks and the walls that they put on present them to be completely different people from very different walks of life.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And I mean, it's so true. Like, we make assumptions based on someone's behavior without understanding anything behind that. And
Yeah.
once you know even just a little bit, I feel like it just completely changes the way that you see them.
Yeah.
And we saw that definitely with Winston. I mean, Winston, I felt like developed that emotional intelligence a bit sooner than Bernice
Yeah.
did. But he was like, something is off because he overheard some conversations, and like he just knew. And because obviously he's spoken to Seb, and Seb had let a few things slip, so that was, yeah, it's just really that was really nice to see. So the character of Winston, there's one line in the book where he remembers that his mom said to him, "I gave you a name that people would easily be able to say." Now, you didn't go into any more detail about that, but to me, that was huge. And it kind of like indicated certain experiences and certain fears about being Indian in Britain.
Yeah.
Um, I wondered where that came from for you, what
Yeah.
you really wanted to bring out, but also why you decided to just kind of like put it in there and move on.
Yeah. So yeah, I kind of, it's interesting because I think there have been a few reviews being like, oh, Winston's Indian, born in India, but why is he called Winston and his sister is called Ruth? Doesn't make any sense to me. And the name Winston, so I actually know someone who grew up in India and his name is a very English sounding name, and everyone always asks him that. And like I never knew the reason why his parents might have named him a very English name when like his parents don't have English names. And I was just thinking, why would you do that? But also I think having grown up as like Sara Nisha, and people have always like mispronounced both my names, it's can be so frustrating when people continually get your name wrong. And actually the person who had this English sounding name, people are always getting his name wrong still. And just I imagine like his mum having named him a very like British name that presumably everyone knows how to pronounce because like Britain is everywhere, and you can just feel like the clutches of it everywhere.
Mm,
And it's a very recognizable name, but if and like so many people feel they have to like anglicize their name to make it easier to pronounce, or just to kind of, yeah, get used to the fact that people mispronounce your name. But I don't think we should have to. But I just like this idea of like this mum sort of thinking ahead, thinking if you're going to be living life potentially like in Britain at some point, because I imagine like maybe she had hopes of her son like going to university there, that maybe she wanted to kind of set a few stepping stones out there to make his life easier, because she felt that having an Indian name would not be easier because people mispronounce names so often. And I only wanted to mention it very briefly because I feel like so many people know what it's like to have their name mispronounced constantly, and how like frustrating it is, but also how like I don't know about you and like if people have mispronounced your name lots like they have mine, but it feels like literally a part of me like shrivels up every time someone gets my name wrong, and it feels like almost like you're invisible to them. So I wanted to just touch on it very briefly for anyone who knew like that experience, and like thinking what maybe Winston's mum was thinking when she was like naming her kids, and the path that she felt that she was setting out for them, and like maybe making things like slightly easier along the way for them. But yeah, I only mentioned it very, very briefly because hopefully the people who know will get it, and the people who haven't had that experience probably won't get it. But yeah, it was just like a little nod to any of us who've had our name mispronounced, when actually our names are beautiful and their pronunciations are important. And even if you have an English sounding name, sometimes people still pronounce it wrong. So,
Yeah. Well, even in the book, Winston, there's a character that calls him Vincent.
yeah, exactly.
And I don't know if she does it on purpose, but because it's unclear if she's just doing it to annoy him. But yeah, she even pronounces Winston wrong, which is fairly English
Yeah.
sounding or pronouncing. I don't know what the right word is. I think it's a bigger question about whether giving like an Indian person or even like a Pakistani person or from anywhere else around the world, giving them a name that isn't typically Indian or
Yeah.
Pakistani, South Asian, wherever it may be, and giving them a name that is more English, does that not feel like a little bit like you're kind of giving up something? You're
Yeah.
giving up part of yourself and you're kind of giving into the pressures of assimilation or acceptance.
Yeah.
Because I think I found that a little bit difficult, because to me that's what it screams. That it's like we can't even pick our own names as we would otherwise have like to choose, and we're constantly thinking, because I hear it a lot as well, like with nieces and nephews and friends that have kids, like just being like, well, we can't choose this name, which is beautiful, like it's a stunning name and it's got a really amazing meaning, but we can't choose it because they're going to butcher it when they go to school and they're not going to pronounce it right. But does it not feel like we're just giving up a little part of ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly kind of the point I wanted to make in it as well. Just like this idea, I wanted to make people think about why Winston's mum would do that and how it feels to have done that, and what it feels to have like decided that she's gonna like, yeah, the fact that she's sort of almost already decided how the world is going to treat her son, and that she has put this in place because she thinks maybe that's a way, and by doing that she has given up a little bit of like who he is and who she is and who their family are. And I that's kind of why I wanted to put it in there too, to like raise that question and point it out, and kind of this idea that because even that name is mispronounced, it shows that ultimately if she'd have named him like an Indian name or a Gujarati name, like how beautiful that would have been, and how things might not have been different at all for him, and how we should be able to like champion our names and be proud of them. And if they're mispronounced, like we shouldn't feel that we can't correct people, because like Winston doesn't even correct Jenny when she gets his name wrong. He just like sucks it up and decides, oh, I don't want to correct it. So yeah, that's kind of exactly what I wanted. I wanted it to feel uncomfortable as well, because I think there are lots of questions that it raises, and that's I only wanted to touch on it because I think I could have written almost like a whole book on that and the identity of like his mum and like everything that everything that's happened in that way. But also I think it's interesting because his mum's name is Manjula, which is a very traditional name, and like Winston and Ruth both have very like English sounding names, and this idea that kind of it then almost puts like a distance between him and his mum, and almost like that distance it's kind of felt in so many ways that he's living in the UK when his mum's still in India. He hasn't been to visit that much. Ruth also lives in Canada, so this idea that almost their names have taken them to these places, and like they've kind of become quite distant from their mum and their family in terms of both sort of like where they're living, but also maybe their culture too. So it was a very deliberate choice, and I think I wanted to make people think, and I don't have all the answers, but I just wanted to put little something in there because there's so much you can think about it. And I would have loved to explore it more, but also it almost would have almost just like a little nugget for people to find and discover and kind of make their own decisions about what it means for Winston and what it means for him as a character and his relationship to himself and his identity and also his culture and where he is now.
Yeah, no, I really get that, because I think that there will be people that will read it and will just accept it. But if you haven't, like, if that doesn't speak to you as an experience and as something that's actually big, because I mean you're right, like every time someone mispronounces your name, I do, like, especially when I was younger, like I did sense this kind of like, well, why aren't you getting it right? It's not that hard.
Yeah.
And that's really difficult. I think, and I guess the issue with it is when it happens repeatedly, happens again and again and again, in different contexts and over time as well. That's really difficult. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I wanted to ask exactly how intentional it was, and I can understand why this wasn't the book to talk about that, because you're right, there could have been a whole story just about his mum choosing her children's names, really, and everything that comes with that, right? Because that's such a big thing.
But I think there are like lots of people who do have names that aren't kind of attached to like their heritage and their identity as well, and kind of what that, because for example, like my first name is Sara, my middle name is Nisha, but Sara is like my English name and Nisha is like my Indian name, and my Indian family always called me Nisha, and my like everyone else like at school and everything always called me Sara, but I always felt that it almost feels like my identity is kind of torn in two a little bit because of those two names, and like they're from different cultures, though actually Sara is a very international name, a multicultural name itself. But yeah, in my head it's always, that's been my English chosen name, Nisha is my Indian chosen name. So names have always been interesting to me, and kind of like moving through the world as a Sara, often called Sarah. It's I kind of in many ways have been Winston, if that makes sense. Like having this name that maybe doesn't completely fit your identity and what that feels like, and people still get it wrong, and this feeling that maybe you can't completely own your name, or like maybe he doesn't completely own his name, but also like he should still be able to own his name because like it was chosen by his mother who loved him. And so I think names have always been quite interesting to me. And when I was writing the story, Winston just came to me straight away because of this person I knew had like a similar name who always got it mispronounced, and I just thought it's just so interesting that our parents feel like they set these paths for us, but actually names hold so much in our identities. So it's only, I'm so glad you picked up on that line though, because like that's one of my favorite moments in the book, because I think it's almost like a shell that you can like crack open, and there's so much within it. So I'm really glad that you picked it up, because it's something that I'm not saying that I felt proud of like including it, but it's like it was something that I really wanted people to think on in all the very different ways that you can take that conversation. But names have always, like being a Sara Nisha is kind of weird for me, but also that's who I am, and that's why I will never like just publish under like Sara Adams, because that's not my full self. That's not my full self. It doesn't capture every single part of me.
And I mean, so that's really interesting, because I still think that there's this huge difference between Sarah and Sara, and how I can imagine that so many people in your life have just assumed that your name is Sarah. And it's not, your name is Sara. And and I mean, I find that, I mean, I assumed automatically that your name is Sara, because I know that you're of Gujarati heritage, in part, but that for you as well must be frustrating. But did you ever feel like there were certain circumstances where you just introduce yourself as Sarah?
There are times when I just like don't bother saying anything, and like if someone says Sarah, I'm just like, I think especially when I was younger, I got to a point when I was like, I really just don't want to correct them. It's going to be so awkward to correct them. And I think I've like gone to so many job interviews where people have just said Sarah and not like let me really have a chance to correct my name. And I remember there was a time like one of my English teachers on the very last day of school, like he'd called me Sarah the whole time, and then when I was saying goodbye, he was like, "Good luck, Sarah." And honestly, it like broke my heart a bit. He was like the one person who had always got my name right, and then right at the end had suddenly got my name wrong, and he probably didn't even notice it, and it was probably just like a slip of the tongue kind of thing. But I will always remember that now. And like there are these moments where I really don't feel like a Sarah. I feel like Sara. Most prominently, I feel like Sara Nisha. And there was a time when I really wanted like everyone to just call me Sara Nisha, but people forget, or like it's easier to just say the first name. So I've always found it weird being called like a different name. And Sara, I've always thought Sara is the name that should be so easy to pronounce. Like you've got Tara, Zara, Kara. Why is it Sara is suddenly Sarah when it's with an S at the front? It doesn't make sense to me.
So true. That's so true. Like Tara, Lara,
Yeah.
Zara, Sarah. Like, what? But yeah, I mean, I have loved hearing about like your own personal experiences. And actually, I have heard you speak about this before, but just as like a final question, because I know we're also running out of time, can you talk about how your own mixed heritage has influenced your writing and the kind of things that you write about and what you want to bring out in your writing?
Yeah, I think it's always been like really important to me to see people like me in books, and it hasn't happened a lot. Yeah, I think I was at an event the other day and was talking about how like the first book where I'd seen like a mixed heritage person was Kim by Rudyard Kipling, and I remember just being like, oh my god, there's someone who's like mixed, like half Indian, half English, just like me. And that's all I took from that book. And actually, let's not talk about that book again. But but anyway, and then I discovered like Zadie Smith, and like how her characters just felt more like the world that I knew and the London that I knew, and like my family in Wembley, and it just made sense to me and made me feel like I can write the stories I want to write. And like I grew up in Hertford, which is like very middle class white area. Like there are only like a few non-white kids in my school, and like actually I was friends with loads of them. My mum was like friends with loads of their mums, which was really nice because it just felt like there were very few of us, and we kind of had a shared experience in what it was like growing up in a place where like yeah, people did look at you a little bit more or kind of ask you, where are you from, like all the time. And when I started writing books, like I knew that I wanted to tell stories about like the world I knew and like the people that I loved and my family. And like yeah, I grew up in a very white area. I'm sure I could write a story just of white people like having garden parties and stuff like that, and just like imagine that world. But for me it felt important to write a diverse cast of characters who felt like people I knew, because that felt more true to me. And I think, yeah, as I said, we need more stories from black and brown authors capturing the worlds that we know and the communities that we live in, to show that there's so many stories that we have, and we are not just writing one kind of story. So I felt I wanted to add to that, and I wanted people to see themselves in my books, even if they'd never seen themselves in like another book before, or like just like those little moments where you're like, oh, I know that dish, like my bar makes that food, or like even just the words like bar and dada, seeing those in a book is just so, has always been so nice for me. So I wanted to kind of pay that forward, like thank the authors who wrote those books that I read and loved, and I want to pay it forward for anyone else who's sort of like loving books for the first time or something and comes across the reading list and just like yeah, sees themselves or sees people they love in it, because for me that feels like the best thing I can do.
Yeah. Oh, that's so nice. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I mean, I do love all the different nods that you kind of do throughout your work to different food and places and experiences without screaming about it or like making it a thing.
Yeah.
I think that kind of very normalized representation is exactly what we need, because we don't need just a constant reminder that this is different, because this is not different for us, right? This is our life.
Yeah.
And you know, I have loved speaking with you today, but you have mentioned, I did say that was my last question, but you have mentioned a few times that you're working on book 3. Can you share like when we can expect it, what we can expect from it? I'm very excited.
I don't think I can say too much yet, and I don't think I can say when it's coming out because I'm not yet sure. But it is basically a story of like mothers and daughters and complicated relationships, and kind of, I guess, like finding out who you are and also who your parents are. That I haven't nailed my pitch yet. So come back to me in like 6 months and hopefully I'll know exactly how to pitch it. But yeah, I think that's all I can share for now. But hopefully it's another story like full of hope and community.
Oh, well, that does sound good. We haven't had mothers and daughters complicated relationships in your books yet, so
No.
that'll be well, thank you so much for your time today, Nisha. This was Sara Nisha.
Oh, I like it when people call me Nisha.
This was so wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Samia. It's been so lovely to talk to you, and your questions have just been so brilliant.
Thank you so much to Sara for such a warm and fun conversation. I loved every second of it, and I hope those who are listening did too. If you enjoy the podcast, please follow The Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the podcast.